Good afternoon and welcome to video chapter 6 on the history of the BBC 1922 to 1995. And I was in the middle of telling you about the different commissions of inquiries which were a source of many much lost sleep among BBC management and even wider among people who were interested in what public service broadcasting could do. Each time there is a commission of inquiry, they're trying to look at where broadcasting is at, how society is changing, what will be needed in the next 10 years. And there's also, of course, very much a political conflict between on different ideas of what public service should be, because some people thought that it was good that the BBC should be a public service just because that gave a certain assurance of independence, of quality, and so on. This may be true or not, but that's what people thought. Whereas other people thought that, well, public service is really, the public sector is really just something we have when we're absolutely obliged to, but it's really not such a wonderful thing. So we got as far as the Hanky Committee. I'd been through the Sykes and the Crawford and so on and so forth, and Allswater, perhaps another one. And so the Hanky Committee, which are often referred to as the Hanky Television Committee, because it was more specialized than the others. It wasn't supposed to talk much about radio, but about television. And it was appointed in September 1943, and it reported in December 1944. So both times then under the national government, under Winston Churchill, which was the government for most of the war. When it was called a national government, it had Labour people in it and Conservative people in it and Liberals in it. Not all in agreement on everything, of course, but united in the idea that the main priority was to win the European war. Who did it have in it? Well, Lord Hanky, Sir Stanley Angwin, Sir Noel Ashbridge, Sir Raymond Burchell, Professor. I'm not sure if there were any women on it. I can't see any women, but a couple of them have only initials, so I can't be absolutely certain. So led by Lord Hanky. So who was Lord Hanky? Well, one of his biographies said that Hanky was somebody who, and I quote, held to the certainties of a late Victorian imperialist, whose policies sought to maintain British domination abroad and to avoid, as far as possible, British entanglement within Europe. And the biographer comments, his patriotism stands inviolable, but his sensitivity to processes of historical change proved limited. So basically he was an old-fashioned believer in the British Empire. And this was the person who was chosen to think about the future of television. So it's not very young and dynamic, but it's not really surprising because obviously, as you know, Winston Churchill was a great believer in the British Empire. He even said at one point, if the British Empire lasts 1,000 years, men will still say this is our proudest hour or finest hour, something like that. So he obviously had the impression that the British Empire had a long future in front of it. Now, the brief of the Hanky Committee, there's Lord Hanky, who, as my grandmother would say, looks like he's lost a shilling and found a penny. He doesn't look like a rapturously happy gentleman, does he? But maybe just the kind of photograph that they wanted at the time. The brief of the Hanky Committee was a more modest one than many of the committees. It was to prepare a plan for the provision of a television service, and I quote, to at any rate the largest centres of population within a reasonable period after the war. So you can see that they weren't thinking immediately of having national television. They were also to study the problems of research and development and to think about the export trade. Okay, so that's what they discussed, television services after the war. Now, of course, the BBC had a monopoly on radio, but there were different opinions. Television was something completely new. Should they give it to the BBC, or should they make another public corporation or private corporation? There were many possibilities, and they decided to give the BBC a monopoly of television services. So this was obviously, in some ways, a homage to the influence and the satisfaction that many people in the elite had for the BBC. They were happy with what it was doing with radio, and so they thought, well, they can do television as well. The committee also made decisions on technical questions, what kind of technology to use, the 405 lines and the television receiver standards, things I don't really understand very much. And they decided that they made some decisions about the financing of television, because of course the money from the radio license, which is what most people were buying, was perhaps not sufficient to finance the development of television, which was very expensive. And so the debates going on about this. And this was going to make a difference to television after the war. Now, television after the war at the beginning, of course, was for tens of thousands of people. It is 10 years later that, or a little more, that more and more people get it. When I was young in 1965, half my class had a television. In my house, we had a television in the winter, but not in the summer. So that this was so that we should play outside. Okay, so that's what we did. Now, I have here for you, just to illustrate something of what the Hanky Committee was thinking about television after the war. Here is a 1948 advert, and you can see this beautiful traditional television, really rather small and black and white, difficult to sell today. And notice what the slogan is: now television, you can't see it all, but it says now television for the million. Notice it doesn't say the millions. It says television for the million. And they're very, very pleased with it. They say, you know, compact, lightweight, superb performance. This is all relative. In fact, televisions until probably 1980 very frequently broke down, and you often had to have the technician around. So this is a 1948 design, lowest price, simplicity of operation. Simplicity of operation, of course, did not include a remote control. But then again, there was only one channel, so you didn't need to change channel. You just need to switch it on and off. So this is the Baird Everyman table model television receiver. Yeah, so it's an Everyman for the general public. And you'll notice that it costs 35 guineas, including purchase tax. Now, even I'm not old enough to remember guineas, but a guinea was, a pound was 20 shillings. And a guinea was 21 shillings. There's a history to this, but I don't even know it, so I'm not going to tell you about it. So a price within the reach of all, 35 guineas. Now, what is interesting here from the point of view of social history is, well, how much was that then? Sorry, I'm going the wrong way, aren't I? Yeah. How much was that then? 35 guineas doesn't mean much, does it? Well, I can tell you it was 10 weeks of an average wage. Remember that an average wage is more than most people get. That's how averages work. Very difficult to compare to today. 10 weeks of an average wage in France today is 3,700 euros. So if you like, you can imagine it costs 3,700 euros. In fact, it's more than that, because at the time, a bigger percentage of people's income was to be used for rent and housing, rent and food. And so they had less extra money to save up to buy a television with. So you're talking about something like several thousand euros. And as you know, several thousand euros today is possible, but for many people, it's quite a problem. You know, I'm not talking about people in extreme poverty, but it's a real effort. On the other hand, remember, when all you have is radio, and you're thinking that if I buy one of these, if I save up and buy one of these, perhaps instead of buying a car, then what will I have? I will have every day entertainment, education, and information in pictures in my house. It's something which is actually really quite surprising and original. Now, here I have the issue of the Radio Times, the magazine, with the listings in it for a day in 1948. And you can see that it's important to remember that we're talking about a few hours a day. 3 or 4 hours a day, perhaps, something like that. Because here you can see on the program you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. There's not a huge amount of things. And what you can see here, or what I could see here when I had my glasses on, was there's Cinderella, which may be a pantomime, I'm not sure. And there was a theatre play over here. And so that these were things going on. Now, television, as I will explain later, had some difficulties because the BBC teams generally saw television as radio with pictures. So it took them quite a long time to learn what was specific about television and what you could do with it. Anyway, those were the sort of things that the Hanky Committee was talking about. And meanwhile, the excited people who were in this industry, this new industry, this exciting new industry, this is the sort of machines they were working with. This is a 1950 camera. So that was rather short because it was a limited brief that the Hanky Committee had. So let's move on to the Beveridge Committee. The Beveridge Committee led by Lord Beveridge. Now, Lord Beveridge was already extremely famous because in the middle of the war, he had written the blueprints for the welfare state. The idea of free doctors, free hospitals, money when you're unemployed, money when you're sick, money for old age pensioners, family allowances, and this whole idea that the community was to look after the weaker members from the cradle to the grave. This incredible idea that people were, which rapidly became extremely popular. And so that was Beveridge. So he was well known. He was a liberal from the Liberal Party. And his committee, the reporter of the Broadcasting Committee, his committee was appointed in June 1949 by Clement Attlee's Labour government. This is the Labour government which brought in huge social reforms, nationalised gas, nationalised coal, nationalised electricity, introduced family allowances, the National Health Service, free doctors, social housing and so on, the welfare state, as we say briefly. And so it was appointed and reported 6 months later to, 18 months later. What am I talking about? 18 months later. Now, this was something much more ambitious. This was the most detailed examination of British broadcasting so far, running to 2 volumes and almost 900 pages. Almost 900 pages. And his instructions were to consider the constitution, control, finance, and other general aspects of the sound and television broadcasting services of the United Kingdom. So you can imagine they looked at what radio did right during the war, what new needs were available, what were needed, what new needs were appearing in peacetime, as well as what television should done. In it was Lord Beveridge and some other aristocrats, but also a couple of members of Parliament. At least 2 women, Lady Meghan and there's another, Mary Stopes. I don't know who these people are. I haven't looked up everybody. So at least 2 women in there. They discussed, should the BBC still have a monopoly? But we were not surprised to see, seen as the general atmosphere of the Labour government was more public sector organisation of services and not less. So we were not surprised that the BBC would continue. It was decided that the BBC would continue as the sole broadcaster, the only people allowed to broadcast. Now, the question of the monopoly was studied in much more detail than previously, but the decision was made in favour of the monopoly. They also discussed the question of advertising. You'll remember there's never been advertising on the BBC. And although some committee members did not agree, the majority felt that advertising would bring down programme standards. And they thought that if there should be competition, this is what they were thinking in 1949, 1950, said, well, if we do need competition, we should have another public corporation producing programs, and so we should have 2 public corporations competing. We don't want private corporations who would be obliged to live from advertising, and therefore they renewed the charter and they kept the BBC with its monopoly, but they asked for things in return. The BBC was to be more accountable to its board of governors on a day-to-day basis. So they wanted a little bit more close consultation. This was not about censorship, but this was about pushing the BBC in the ways that they thought were appropriate. They also insisted that the BBC should consult its viewers and listeners more and start to actually listen and take account of their views. Now, this is a complicated question. Doing what your viewers want is a complicated question because there's different ways to do it. You can have a general opinion poll and, you know, well, you couldn't phone 1,000 people there. You knock on 1,000 people's doors and ask what their opinions are. Or you can react to everybody who sends you letters. Now, of course, if it's a BBC in 1950, you react to everybody who sends you letters and go in the same direction as the majority of letters, you're basically reacting to the middle class who are more used to writing people letters and complaining. The other thing which was demanded was to serve the nations and regions better, that is Scotland, Wales and the regions, and to allow the creation of local BBC radio stations. And finally, it was said that the BBC should be careful that they cater to minority needs and tastes. There's a very, very important key expression here, minority needs and tastes. And it's not always clear, I think we need to explore this further, it's not always clear exactly what is meant by this, because very often we assume it means make sure that there is opera on the BBC, even though most people don't want to listen to opera. But it hasn't always meant just that. It can be other kinds of minority needs and tastes. Quite a wide brief here. I remember putting on the blog a documentary about Radio 2, which underlined the role of Radio 2 in catering to minority needs and tastes. In particular in specific kinds of music. So I want you to keep in mind this expression minority needs and tastes over the next few weeks, because I think we will have more to say about it. They also wanted, the Beveridge Committee also wanted the BBC to have more scope to make political programs. And also that they should recognise trade unions among their own workers. So this is very much a Labour Party encouragement. Now, so in this period, just in the 50s, then, of course, we have both radio and television, but sometimes we forget radio as soon as television arrives. So when television arrives in 1948, we start thinking about television and forget radio. We must absolutely not do that. Look at this amazing set of statistics. You can find that in 1948, £700,000 was spent on television and £6.5 million on radio. So in 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952, clearly radio was the essentially important part of the BBC. And even right up to 1955, in 1955, the importance of television is rising, and we always talk about the coronation of 1953 as a television event which made television much more popular. Nevertheless, in 1955, the BBC is still spending double on radio what they spend on television. Very, very important thing here. Now, so that's I've told you basically what the Beveridge report said. However, a minority disagreed. Selwyn Lloyd, just one member, a member of Parliament, Selwyn Lloyd. I'm pretty sure he was a Conservative member of Parliament, but do check. He wrote a minority report. Yeah, that's not like the Spielberg film. So you got basically the Beveridge report, but Selwyn Lloyd said, no, I don't agree with this. I'm not signing it. I'm going to write my report, which was shorter. And he was kind of lucky in a way, because shortly after the publication of the report in 1950, well, the next year, 1951, the Conservatives won the general election. And so what the Labour government had said they wanted was no longer so important. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister again. However, it has to be said that the politics of the Winston Churchill government from 1951 were very different from what Winston Churchill was saying in 1945, because in 1945, Winston Churchill was saying, we don't want the welfare state, the National Health Service. That's almost like fascism. I'm not exaggerating. He really did say these things. However, from 1945 to 51, the Conservative Party began to understand, doctors are free and hospitals are free. If we refuse to accept this idea, free hospitals, free doctors, etc. We will never win an election again. It is the most popular thing in the last century. And so Winston Churchill became prime minister again, but he was surrounded by younger ministers who were considerably less right-wing than his previous team. He had understood that campaigning against the welfare state, as he had done in 1945, would be disastrous. The political conditions had changed and he had to adapt. So although the political situation meant that Winston Churchill absolutely could not reverse the social legislation of the Labour government and of Attlee, he did decide not to follow the opinion of the majority of the commission of Beveridge. Instead, he insisted that private television should be established, and it will be established 5 years later. Nevertheless, they did accept, the new Conservative government did accept that the BBC should maintain its monopoly in radio. And notice this is 1951, radio is still the biggest show in town. So the television was pushed towards establishing a private channel and therefore competition for the BBC, but radio stayed more or less how it was. Now, over the following years, there was a series of debates about this, and this is just a poster about one of these debates. I just wanted to underline the fact that these commissions of inquiries and the debates did not just happen in the Houses of Parliament and among ministers and the great and the good who'd been chosen for these commissions of inquiry. No, they were quite general. This is Equity. Equity is the Actors Union. And of course, the Actors Union was very interested in television, but rather worried about television. Well, nobody will come to the theatre if television is showing plays every night. What are we going to do? And of course, if you go to the theatre, you fill the house every night for a month if you've got a good play. Whereas on the television, you show it once, and that's it. Where are you going to get enough money to pay everybody? And so here you have a debate where the BBC's director of television is invited by the Actors Union to speak in public about the future of television. People are still very confused. This is what, 1953? People know that television is important, but they don't really know what its future is or how big it's going to be, and so on and so forth. So let's move on to the next. Every time we're jumping 10 years, yes, because you're not going to have a commission of inquiry every year. Give it a chance. And so in 1960, the Pilkington Committee. They are very important to know the committees, not because they were the only deciders, not at all. There were many things going on, but they are important punctuation which helps you to structure your understanding of the history and also shows the importance of debates, because every time there was a new commission of inquiry, they got new information about how broadcasting was changing, sometimes very surprising ways. People did not see what television was going to do. So Sir Harry Pilkington was the gentleman who headed up the Pilkington Committee, and here he is. This is when he's older. He was younger than that, but as you can see, he's also obviously one of the great and the good, and he's got his portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. So who was he? Well, he was from the elite. He was privately educated at Rugby School, you know, the school where they invented a long time ago the game, and he was in fact the he moved into the glass-making business with his father was in the glass-making business, if I understand correctly. And at the time when he moved in, there were many different glass-making companies in Britain, and basically the others died from the competition, and Pilkington became the British glassmaking company. I don't know where it is today, but certainly when I was younger, Pilkington was the glassmaking company. Indeed, in 1967, the company Pilkington made 85% of the glass in Britain and exported its products to over 100 countries. Okay, so he was on there. Obviously, a big capitalist, really, a big boss. And so we're not surprised, really, to see that the Conservative government in 1960, we still had a Conservative government under Harold Macmillan, the man who's famous for being called Super Mac, the man who is connected with the Wind of Change speech about colonialism in Africa. This was established by the Conservative government in 1960 and reported in 1962 also to the Conservative government. Now, although it's set up by the Conservative government, as in previous commissions, they also include other people. Of course, they make sure that the majority of people on their committee are vaguely sympathetic to the government, but they want to have other voices, technical voices, scientific voices, but also even cultural or political voices, even from the other side, partly because they want to understand the situation so they can make good decisions, and also partly because they're hoping that what they put forward will be accepted, perhaps reluctantly, by the government if there is a change of party. Also on the committee was Richard Hoggard, a famous sociologist. I don't often use the word famous, but he actually is famous, a very well-known sociologist, let's say, and the author of The Uses of Literacy, which is a classic book about popular culture. And Richard Hoggard's opinion, to summarize horrifically briefly, was that popular culture, working class culture, was in decline. The closely knit communities of the past were disappearing, and they were somehow being taken over by Americanized commercial culture. That was his opinion about it. So that's what he says in this book. It's much more complicated than that, of course. And so he had opinions and theories about popular culture, about working class culture. And this is something that's going to interest the Commission of Inquiry, because they understood that radio was being listened to by tens of millions of people, and that television also was heading for the many, many millions. And so understanding something about popular working class culture was obviously important, even if they didn't have necessarily the same priorities. Now, the Pilkington Committee consulted both with the BBC and with the Independent Television Authority, who supervised private television. And they decided, the Pilkington Committee report says, it's more complicated than people think. You have the stereotype of the two positions: the commercial television, who presents themselves as, we give the people what the people want. That's the stereotyped slogan of the commercial television. And the stereotyped slogan of the BBC would be, we give the people what we think is good for the people. And now, in fact, the Pilkington says it's more complicated than that. You cannot reduce the debate just to these two parts. In fact, they say, first of all, they say that private television, and I quote, claims to know what the public is, but defines it as no more than a mass audience, and limits the public's choice to the average of experience. Whereas they also criticize the BBC because they think that they know what is in the public's best interests. And both approaches are accused of reducing the public to a passive and undifferentiated mass. And so the Pilkington report, to some extent, refuses to choose completely for one or the other of these two. In any case, the Pilkington report focused on the question of programme quality. Difficult question, difficult to define programme quality. But nevertheless, it considered that the BBC was far better. And in fact, they said, and I quote, the BBC know good broadcasting, by and large, they are providing it. And on the other hand, ITV, the commercial television, was falling well short of what a good public service of broadcasting should be. Because notice here, they're considering that private television channels are still a public service because it's for the public. And so what do they say? They say, well, the Independent Television Authority should supervise much more closely what the different regional independent television companies do, because independent television was set up as a network where a different company had Yorkshire and another company had Lancashire. They were private companies. But there was the Independent Television Authority which supervised, and they said we want more supervision. They also spoke about the third television channel. They said the third television channel, we want to give it to the BBC. We don't want to give another commercial one. We wanted to give it to the BBC. And in the radio, the BBC should keep its monopoly. So the BBC were generally happy with the result of this. Whereas the report criticized commercial television for triviality. And they said, the report said, those who say they give the public what it wants begin by underestimating public taste and end by debauching it. That's a very strong expression. Say, if these commercial channels, they say they're giving the public what they want, but in fact, they begin by underestimating the public, and they end by corrupting the public by giving them bad stuff and getting them used to it. So that's what they go to. That's what they go through. They also recommend adult education broadcasting, so those are the most important element there. And finally, one more quote from the Pilkington report. We conclude that dissatisfaction with television can be largely ascribed to the independent television service. So this is fascinating, because they're saying, you know, if there is unhappiness about television today, it's mostly ITV's fault and not the BBC's. So this is fascinating, because the ITV had far more viewers than the BBC. They attracted millions more, perhaps not millions. We're still talking of yes, probably millions more. Yes, they attracted far more. Oh dear. And so if you read between the lines here, Pilkington is saying the people who are the intellectuals and other elite people who are unhappy with the television are very important to us, and the millions of people who prefer ITV are not so important to us. Basically, when Pilkington report talks about dissatisfaction with television, they mean dissatisfaction from politicians and doctors and teachers and so on, and not of necessarily the general public. Another change here then was that the results of the report included the BBC local radio. So that's what the government generally followed its recommendations, even though it was set up by the Conservative government. They followed these recommendations. Both BBC and ITV were required to increase their educational outputs, and the new channel was given to the BBC. BBC had started up in 1964, I think. The Labour Party suggested, they were not the government, okay, so it wasn't, you know, nobody really cared what they suggested, but they suggested that the future BBC Two should be entirely devoted to education. So this shows something, yeah, that the opposition party at this time was saying, this is the 1960s, and education was a rising vote, saying, well, yes, we want this channel, only education, which is, you know, quite an ambitious demand, just because, of course, people wanted many more things. But it was decided not to do that. And indeed, the Director General, Carlton Green, preferred a second mainstream channel, but one with more cultural, that is more high culture, and more experimental content than the existing channel, which, of course, would now be called BBC Two. And when BBC Two set up, one of its first documentary series, which was extremely popular and considered to be of extremely high quality by the people who knew about it, was The Great War. And so this was like the symbol of BBC Two in the 60s, was this documentary series, which went in some depth, and people still buy today on DVD too, on DVD. So that was then the Pilkington Committee, and we still have a couple of committees left, but I've got over time, and so the final committees will be in the next video, which may be a little bit shorter because I think there's only 2 or perhaps 3 left, but we're going to stop there. So thank you for listening. I wonder if I can find this here, get this sorted here. I'm having a little problem stopping it. Aha. Yes. Oh, there you go. Arrêtez de partager. Fin. Just have a look at the little doll before I leave you. Mettre fin à la